Hello, my name is Gary Lawrence, and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for AECOM. AECOM is a global design and engineering firm, 45,000 people with over 110 offices around the world, around Fortune 350. We're absolutely committed to the idea of sustainability in everything we do, and a critical part of that is our work on matters related to climate. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our office here in New York and to be part of the release by CDP of their 2014 report, Protecting Our Capital. Again, this year we were honored to work with CDP in helping convert the data they collect with their city partners into information from which comparisons can be drawn, progress measured, and optimal solutions be developed so the essential questions of mitigation and resilience can be addressed. For the municipalities, neighborhoods, and the private enterprise that make up the economies of these cities, successful solutions have to meet three tests. They have to be technically feasible, economically viable, and politically acceptable. What this report does, and has done in the past, is draw out from the conversations with cities information that allows these factors individually and collectively to be addressed more successfully. It's a great honor for AECOM to be part of this event and part of the partnership with the CDP to produce this information. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Connor Riffle, who is CDP's Director for Cities and Data Product Information. I didn't know that it was this title. It's just Connor as far as I'm concerned. So let me welcome Connor. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gary. And hello, everyone, and welcome. A very warm welcome to all of you in the room, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us via live stream from around the world. My name is Connor Riffle. I'm the Director of Cities and Product Innovation at CDP. And today we're gathered here to celebrate a wonderful milestone in climate change reporting. Over 200 cities around the world now report their climate change data through the CDP system in a standardized annual way. We have a fantastic group of cities that reported to CDP this year, and almost double the number of cities that reported last year. In addition to a large group of very large cities like New York and Tokyo and Seoul and Philadelphia that are part of C40 that have been reporting to CDP for 4 years now. We also have a wide, varied group of cities from around the world who are just joining us this year, reporting for the first time. And just to give you a quick sample of these new cities, we have Winnipeg, Edmonton, Pittsburgh, Lexington, Kentucky, Columbus, Ohio in North America. We have Juarez and Puebla in Mexico. Campinas and Florianopolis in Brazil, alongside 25 other new cities in Latin America. We have Abidjan and Pretoria in Africa, Venice and Padua in Italy, and Faro in Portugal, Wellington in New Zealand, Shenzhen in China, and a total of 33 cities in South Korea. So you can see this is a very wide and disparate group, and we'll get into a little bit more of the data as we go forward. The big story in this year's data, which you're going to hear a little bit about later on, is the subject of our report, and is really about climate risk to business. Specifically, it's about how cities are taking a leading role in adapting to climate change, and in the process, playing a crucial role in protecting the businesses that are based in their cities from some of these climate risks. Our special guests are going to illuminate this subject for you during our program in just a little bit. Before we get started, I just want to say a couple of special thank yous to the folks who have made this event possible. The first group I want to thank is AECOM for welcoming us and hosting us at their wonderful offices, for doing a fantastic job in helping us produce this report, and for being the lead sponsor of CDP Cities. So a big thank you to AECOM. And then I have two other special thank yous. And the first is for C40, which is, as many of you know, a network of the world's largest cities dedicated to climate change. 4 years ago, we brought C40 a very interesting and slightly controversial idea, which is that we could find a way together to encourage the world's cities to engage in annual climate change reporting together. C40 was kind enough to believe in us at that early date, and I'm very, very proud that 90% of C40 cities are now reporting annually through CDP's platform. So a big thank you to C40. The second partner I want to acknowledge is Bloomberg Philanthropies. Bloomberg Philanthropies stepped up with a very significant investment in CDP Cities this year for CDP's work on cities, which was enabling this report and enabling some very serious growth for our program going forward. So I'm grateful, and we are grateful to Bloomberg Philanthropies for their belief in the power of cities and their leadership on this issue, and for their belief in CDP. There are many, many others who have made this report possible as well. I mentioned Korea. We have a fantastic partner in Korea called the Korea Productivity Center, who are spreading the gospel far and wide and very successfully in Korea. And some other very strong believers around the world. We this year signed MOUs with the government of Italy and the government of Portugal, and those MOUs were instrumental in helping us work to encourage new cities in those countries to report. So a big thanks to them. I want to just say one quick word about the report. It's no accident that we are launching this report in New York City. New York City is a city that knows all too well about the dangers of climate risk. It was just about a year and a half ago that Hurricane Sandy struck the city, killing 44 New Yorkers and causing a lot of damage to the billions. So many know the terrible facts about that storm, but I think what this report helps to bring out is many don't know the story of the work that was done behind the scenes by the city of New York to make sure that when a hurricane like Sandy struck, it wasn't as impactful and wasn't as painful for the citizens of New York as it could have been. And we hope that this report helps to highlight that and the work of many other cities around the world that are working on this exact issue. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first very special guest, Claire Bonham-Carter from AECOM. She's going to walk you through the data that we collected this year from cities and talk about the report. She is Principal and Director of Sustainable Development at AECOM. Claire?
Thank you, Connor, and hello, everybody. It is really exciting to be up here talking about the analysis that we have done on the incredible data set that CDP collected this year. Now, as Connor said, it's nearly a doubling from last year, and I want to take the opportunity to thank all those 207 cities who no doubt invested a lot of blood, sweat, tears, curses, phone calls with colleagues, wheedling data out of different departments to fill in the survey, which is not insignificant. They collected hundreds of data points for us on their greenhouse gas inventories, on emission reduction targets, on mitigation activities, on the risks, the opportunities they see from climate change, and also the adaptation activities. Both Gary and Connor alluded to a little bit about why we're collecting this data. It's not just data for data's sake. It's really to help us, businesses, the cities really understand what their problems are and what they can be doing and doing better to help mitigate some of those issues. Now, I wanted to share a little bit about the spread of the data set that we have. This is a stylized map of the world, and I hope you can see from the different dots the great global spread of cities that we have. Now, Connor pointed out the cluster in Korea, which you can see to the far left there, but I want to give a shout out to Brazil in Latin America. If CDP was the World Cup, it would be Brazil 29, Germany 3. They have some work to do. Now, the last thing I want to say about the diversity of the data was just the size of the cities that reported. We have small cities. We have, you can probably read it better than I, 91 small cities, so that's less than 600,000 people, and 57 large cities, so over 1.6 million. And I think that diversity means there's a richness, there's a spread, that lots of different cities can find themselves, if you like, in the data. So just bear that in mind when I'm talking about our results. It's this set of cities that we're talking about. Now, what did we produce this year? We like to keep you guessing. We like to mix it up. Last year, we produced a summary report and a thematic report. This year, you get a summary poster. So actually, the thing that you've seen out at the back, you'll get to take one of these home tonight. And why have we done it like this? Because we think the message is so important, we want you to put it up in your offices. We want to give it to your clients or give it to your kids to put up at school. This just makes our data, the data, much more visible. We also have produced a thematic report again. This is something we did for the first time last year, and I'll be talking a little bit more about the content of this around protecting our capital. Now, I'm going to spend, 6-7 minutes just giving you some highlights of some of the data, starting off with the summary. Now, there has been a bit of a focus on risk and adaptation this year, and we found that 190 of our 207 cities are reporting natural risks to their cities. Only 2 of those 207 said no. We're not seeing that. The mismatch, they're not sure yet. They don't know. Now, the pattern of risks that we're seeing from temperature increase and heat waves, from frequent and intense rainfall, it's pretty similar to last year, and they're pretty big numbers. 76% of cities reporting risks from temperature increase and heat waves. 68% reporting risks from more frequent and intense rainfall. Those are big, scary numbers. And actually, we also ask, well, how severe do you think that risk is? When are you seeing that risk happen? 53% of those risks are deemed to be serious and near term. Now, I actually think that's a really useful message for cities being challenged by their constituents that climate change isn't something that they should be dealing with. Those cities can point to nearly 200 cities globally that are seeing risk from climate change and are seeing them as serious and as near term. And I think that's a really useful message to share. Now, it's not all bad news. There is some good news that 60% of our cities, the reporting cities, have done some kind of vulnerability assessment to try and figure out, how bad the risk is. And this is a really important first step to moving to adaptation planning. Now, it's not all about adaptation. CDP actually stands for Carbon Disclosure Project. We are still looking at emissions. It's still a core part of the CDP's mission to think about greenhouse gas mitigation. And this year, 108 cities reported a whopping 1.2 billion metric tons of CO2. But that's only about half our sample who are doing greenhouse gas inventories. And it's really important that we encourage more of them to do their inventories. And why? There is value in doing an inventory, real value. It helps those cities really focus their actions on the sectors that are causing the most emissions. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a comparison of Rio and Boston's inventories. Now, if Rio hadn't done an inventory and looked to Boston's climate action plan, they would over-focus on commercial unnecessarily and completely miss the industrial sector. And I'm not saying that Rio would ever look to Boston as a comparison, but you get the picture. You really need to understand where your emissions are to make sure that your planning is right. Now, that's all I'm going to say about the summary report. You can check out the poster later on in more detail. And moving swiftly on to the thematic report protecting our capital. Now, we've done something new this year. You probably know that CDP collects data from companies, 5,000 companies, in fact, this year. And what we did was compare some of the data that we collected from the cities with the data that we collected from the companies. Now, this is actually building a little bit on the theme of last year's thematic report, which is around climate action being good for economies, not something that people automatically think about. And this week, I noticed that the UK Grantham Institute actually reported that the UK climate change policy has not damaged UK competitiveness. In fact, that it could increase the UK's innovation and efficiency. Just remember that you read that first last year in CDP's 2013 thematic report. So what kind of impacts are cities reporting that businesses are facing? This is an example from Jakarta, who report, development sectors are threatened by climate change: energy, agriculture, fisheries, infrastructure, health. These sectors could fail unless climate change is anticipated and responded to properly. Those sectors, to me, sound like the whole of the fabric of Jakarta is at risk. Another example, Sao Paulo, who are worried that industries requiring intensive water use, like the soda industries, might choose to invest in another region because of water scarcity. What about San Francisco? If the built environment of San Francisco is not adapted to allow for dynamic environmental changes, then businesses will face a wide range of business disruptions. Rio actually are more specific than that. They're worried because many of their financial and service industries are concentrated in one particular low-lying area, which would be completely inundated by just 1 meter of sea level rise. Now, what kind of disruption is being expected for cities? There are a whole range of things, and this rather wonderful Neapolitan ice cream graphic displays it. Property and capital being the biggest proportion, the surrounding communities, the availability of raw materials, really important for making stuff, infrastructure, tourism, a whole list of different things that cities are worried about that are going to be impacted by climate change. And it's 76% of our cities that actually think these things will be a risk. So now getting into the comparison between the company data that CDP has collected and the city data. What we did was compare the risks reported by companies and recognized by cities, a collection of companies in a collection of cities. And what do I mean by this? So looking at these bars here, the top line there is reporting risks reported by companies from drought. But of the 18 risks reported by companies, only 5 were being recognized by the cities that company is located in. Of the 68 risks being reported around storms and floods, only 45 are being recognized by the cities. The potential threat here being that if a company finds itself in a city which is not recognizing the same risks, the company may think twice about investing long-term in that city if they don't think the city is going to be dealing with those problems. We also looked at the alignment in severity of risks reported by companies and recognized by cities, and see some of the same variation. Only 75% of the most extreme risks reported by companies are also recognized by the cities. Now, this is important, as businesses may think the cities will be starting to tackle the wrong risk first. So what does this tell us? Well, we really think there's a need for more and better collaboration between the public and private sector to make sure there's more gained understanding of vulnerability and of risk tolerance to give businesses the security that they're really operating in a resilient city, or at least one that has aspirations to be more resilient. Now, lots of talk of risk here. Where's the positive in all of this? Well, of those, the 75% of extremely serious risks that both companies and cities report, where the city does recognize the risk, in 96% of cases, so almost all cases, the city is actually taking action to mitigate that risk, which is a great thing. So the important point, again, is the value of future collaboration between cities and business to help make sure that both sides fully identify and manage the same risks. So to summarize, I think it's pretty clear that adapting to climate change is absolutely critical to the success of cities and the businesses within them and their local economies. And I think what our analysis is showing that we do need more cooperation between cities and businesses to really align understanding and response to climate change risks so that cities maintain the high trust of different companies that their location is resilient and will be long into the future. And that this cooperation will really help to facilitate cities deliver adaptation actions that reduce risk for their businesses and communities. Now that's the high level little bit of data that I'm going to tell you about right now. Remind you that we have this great report and the poster that I think you'll be able to take home at the end of the night. Please share it, use the poster. We don't want it to be folded up on a shelf somewhere. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Claire. Very, very interesting, and the posters are available for folks as they leave. I'd now like to introduce our other very special guest, who I'm delighted to have you meet. Retired U.S. Navy Vice Admiral Lee Gunn served in the Navy in various posts around the world for 35 years, including as Inspector General of the Navy. He is president of CNA Corporation's Institute for Public Research in Alexandria, Virginia. CNA, if you don't know it, is a nonprofit research and analysis institution with a very long track record of research. The group's paper, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, has raised the global security ramifications of climate change and fossil fuel dependence, and we're going to hear a little bit about that from Vice Admiral Gunn today. He is also Vice Chair of CNA's Military Advisory Board, which is now a 35-member team of retired U.S. generals and admirals who have gathered over the last 8 years to highlight the national security challenges in the United States of climate change and energy generation. So Vice Admiral Gunn speaks across the nation on how climate change will affect global security, and he's here today to share his thoughts with us. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming retired Vice Admiral Lee Gunn.
I'm stunned by the report that you put together and the effort that those of you who've been involved in its preparation have devoted to amassing the data and doing the analysis. But as much as anything, I'm impressed mightily by the quality of your graphics and the displays. You know, so often things like this fall down. There must be somebody in the audience who claims at least partial credit for the graphics and the presentational skills that are evident in here. So I congratulate you on that. And that means a lot, because in the field that we're in, the things that we're talking about today, it's terribly important that the message get across. We can't be satisfied ourselves that we understand as much as is understandable about the problem, and that we personally or collectively are willing to take action. We have to convince others to do so. That's one of the reasons that I've been so pleased and honored to be part of the retired flag and general officer group that has been the Military Advisory Board for the last 8 years at CNA. 11 members gathered, all volunteers, in 2006, 2007 to consider from a national security perspective what the ramifications of climate change might be. It was a new way of looking at things. And the report to which Connor referred did in fact make quite a splash. It made a splash for a number of reasons. One is that many of the people who are the most reluctant here in the United States to appreciate the threat of climate change are also reluctant to talk about it and to listen to people talk about it. And yet when you've got a bunch of former military folks who are willing to come around and say we were skeptics to begin with, many of us, We have been convinced by the research, we've been convinced by the evidence, and we've translated that research and evidence into what we believe, based on our military experience, are the security ramifications of what's facing us as a nation and as a planet. We have a message that resonates with people. We've written 3 other reports in the interim that dealt with energy and American competitiveness and leadership in the world, and specifically about transportation problems, both militarily and in the commercial world, where perhaps some of the most thorny issues are that have to be dealt with if we're going to mitigate climate change and carbon emissions. And then in May, 2 months ago, we published an update of the 2006-7 report, talking about the accelerating risks of climate change. We thought it was important to revisit that original report. Great that it made a splash. Nice that people were willing to listen to us. But we wanted to say that we were right in some areas, we were wrong in some areas, but the facts are that science is coalescing around the facts of climate change and about the human contribution, for those of you who are skeptical about that. Things are happening in many cases, in many important ways, faster than we had anticipated. And there is a national security dimension to the preparations that need to be made for this. Now, the great thing, from my point of view, having been here today and having prepared a little in advance by reading your report, is that I see that there are many of you, many people involved with cities and companies around the world in a way that, frankly, I hadn't imagined until recently. So that's part of the message that needs to get out as well, and I think your report is going to be very effective in helping to do that. So what happens when we go around the nation and sometimes internationally to talk to audiences who might be skeptical about climate change, certainly have their doubts about the human contribution, and at the heart of the matter are reluctant to make the changes that of the kind that we all believe are going to be necessary in order to face the challenges that we face in the future. Well, for one thing, we say, what's new in climate change? You know, many of the arguments about climate change from the folks who are skeptical about it hinge on the notion that the climate has changed before. And absolutely that's true. I mean, the geology, the ice cores, the archaeology, in fact, all say that that has happened. So I'm challenged by audiences to tell them what's new. When I was born, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet. There are 7.1 billion people today, and it's going to 9 by all predictions. That's new. There has never been a load placed on the resources and the territory of this planet like the one that we're imposing on it now. The rural to urban movement is new because people are experiencing increasingly the effects of climate change in a rural environment, and they're looking for opportunities in urban settings. And the kinds of reports you get, the willingness of cities and companies who rely on those cities to report to you, is emblematic, in my view, of the fact that there's a groundswell of things happening, and that's new. The infrastructure doesn't move easily. Humans have set their roots over the last 12,000 years when the climate has been pretty predictable and relatively stable. And moving infrastructure that in a way that will be responsive to the effects of climate change, the impacts of climate change, will be terribly expensive and requires an enormous amount of creativity and innovation and perhaps planning most of all. And what about national governments? Well, the national government, the quality of national governments ranges widely as we look around the world. Some are great at planning, they're visionary, they execute well, and they hopefully will be leaders as we move into the future facing climate change. Some are dreadful. Some national governments are inept, corrupt, poor, and can barely hang on to the services that they need to provide to their populations. And those will be stressed to the extent that we anticipate in this national security perspective of climate change that there will be increasingly failed and failing states. And the result of the lack of governance and the lack of furnishing of support to the citizens of these countries will provide breeding grounds for a continuation of the kind of activities that we're seeing right now break out around the world. But the good is the city and corporate initiative and innovation that you portray among the entities who are willing to report to you. The proximity of city governments to their citizens and the responsiveness that results from that. And we see that, in fact, when we hit the road and talk about the Military Advisory Board results. We see that our frustration with our national government, in the case of the United States, can be countered in many cases by the breakout of initiative and innovation that's taking place locally. And the recognition that companies and their cities must work together, that's new and that's important, and the willingness of these entities to take risks. Perhaps most importantly of all, the willingness of these entities, the cities and the companies, to share the results of what they take risks at, and to not only talk, I hope, about their successes, but also talk about their failures. Because it's every bit as important for City A to say to City B, we know you're considering this, we tried that, don't do it the way we did it. Here's our recommendation. So that's what's new in the Earth's climate on the bad side and the good side. I'd like to say that we're pleased, the Military Advisory Board, to be in harness with you all. And we hope that we can work together increasingly in the future to be effective in getting the analysis done and the word out to the people who need to have it. Thanks.
Well, that was fascinating, sir. And what I wanted to do is just dive a little bit more into the Vice Admiral's thoughts on the current state of global security and how it relates to climate change and to business and to cities. So I'm just going to walk him through a few questions, and we are going to have some opportunity for audience to ask questions as well of both the Vice Admiral and of Claire, and also Larissa, who's one of the authors of the report, in just a minute. So start thinking of your questions now. Vice Admiral, why don't you just start maybe briefly by telling us just very quickly how you got interested in climate change?
It's kind of a natural for me. My dad was in the Navy, and after World War II, I told you that I indicated I was probably the oldest guy in the room. I'm pretty sure of that. But when there were 2.5 billion people on the planet, we had the opportunity to live in the South Pacific. We lived in Pohnpei. After the war, and islands in the South Pacific are at risk to a degree that is startling. It's terrible to them, and it's still largely ignored. Do we have a?
Why don't you try this one?
Good. Okay. Quickly. The second thing is I'm a city manager's kid. Okay, I was a city manager's kid. But you can tell a city manager's kid by the fact that he really does like it at 2 o'clock in the morning when he's rolled out of the sack by his dad, who says, I just got a call, do you want to go for a ride and check out the problem at the wastewater management facility? That kind of gets in your blood after a while. And the third thing is, as a sailor, I spent a lot of years at sea, particularly in the period when predictions of storms at sea were far less accurate than they are now. I've seen violent weather. I've been in conditions where medium-sized warships were really at risk of capsizing. And so I appreciate the violence of the weather potentially, and I am very concerned about the frequency and severity of storms that we all face in the future.
That's great. British Airways, the airline, told us in one of their CDP responses this year, quote, "There are expected to be shifts in patterns of global trade, agricultural production, and tourism as a result of climate change's effects. Climate change's effects may also lead to market disruption that could present significant risks." So I'm interested, what do you see as the connection between that business disruption that BA is talking about and global security?
My friend Mike Mullen, who was chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff until a couple of years ago, used to say that economic strength was an essential element of national power. Economic well-being is essential to quality of life and the opportunity for people to flourish and grow around the world. We in the U.S. military, I think other militaries in the world like to believe that we play an important role in establishing and helping maintain security and stability, which provides part of the context into which real commerce, successful business can be conducted. Global sea lanes carry 90+% of all the international trade in the world. In 1973, you may remember, some of you, the oil shocks, the oil embargo in the Middle East, and the devastation that caused for commerce throughout the world. And we have also put ourselves in a position, for all the right reasons, to be very vulnerable to disruptions in manufacturing and supply chain by using just-in-time delivery. Now, we've avoided warehousing, we've avoided costs associated with that in the process. It's the right thing to do, but it also means that the resilience of the supply chain, the willingness and willingness to provide and the availability of the goods necessary to put things together at the last minute has to be assured. And so I think that's some of the kind of things that BA was talking about.
That's great. Well, I just wanted to jump on one of those a little bit more deeply, and this is actually something you referenced in your, thank you, in your remarks. Barranquilla in Colombia, one of the cities that reported to CDP this year, told us, excessive rain, this is a quote, excessive rain has created flooding problems, leaving a large number of victims, which has generated migration into Barranquilla. Addis Ababa in Ethiopia told us, quote, migration of people from rural areas to urban areas increased due to shortage of water and decreasing annual rainfall, which affects agricultural activities in the rural area. And Wellington told us New Zealand is expected to be a major source of migration from low-lying Pacific islands vulnerable to sea level rise. Some of these new migrants, refugees, will likely settle in Wellington. So these are a few examples of what you referenced of how climate change is going to drive population into cities. Just from your experience, what types of issues, what types of kind of geopolitical issues does this rural to urban migration raise?
Internal migration and migration across borders tends to stress resources wherever it happens. We're struck by the loads that are being placed on cities' resources by this kind of migration. Earlier, before we sat down here, I was part of a discussion of what's happened in Syria and the linkage that the crop losses, the prices of wheat played, certainly not in causing the problems that have occurred in Syria, but in catalyzing them. That's an example, I think, of the migrations from the rural to the urban environment and the unreadiness, the lack of readiness of the cities to deal with this onslaught of people, and that causes this whole new category of stresses. So I think that in the first report on climate change and national security, we said that climate change was a threat multiplier. This time we said it was a catalyst for conflict, because we see these kinds of things happening around the world. And it's something as military people that we're very concerned about having to deal with in the future.
Definitely, definitely. Okay, that's great. Some folks in the room will be familiar with Benjamin Barber's new book, If Mayors Ruled the World, which identifies a trend towards increasing local action in the face of red tape and inaction at the national level. And I think we saw from the data that Claire presented that you know, in the data that we have at CDP, it shows thousands of actions by cities to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change, often in the context of national governments who aren't taking as many actions. So I'm curious, Vice Admiral, as a national security thinker and someone who thinks a lot about national government, you know, walk us through what you see as that balance between kind of the national government's leadership on issues like this and the local leadership, which is bubbling up and is so present in our data.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Connor. National leadership is vital, and I don't think that anything that is being done by cities and companies should be considered to be letting governments off the hook. National governments are responsible, whether they fulfill this responsibility or not, for providing an envelope, a context in which business can be conducted, people can be safe, services can be provided, good jobs can be created and sustained. I've been accused on the road of saying that my very own government here in the United States is constipated. I don't want to admit to using that word however, the fact is that governments can become cumbersome entities, cumbersome organizations. And one of the great things about cities, I think, is that not only are they close to their populations, as I indicated in my opening remarks, but they're also pretty fleet of foot. And when things change, they can change with it. So I think the important thing to do, having witnessed some of these local initiatives, is to give them voice, as you're doing, to make sure that these initiatives, the innovation that's taking place in cities and companies in supporting one another, is reflected in the voice of the people for the national governments as well.
Great. That's great. So you also touched briefly on renewable energy, and I just wanted to press you a little bit about that. I think the recommendations that your group put forward for the Department of Defense include quite a bit of focus on renewable energy and shifting away from fossil fuels. So. But one of the things we're increasingly hearing from cities, which I think definitely comes out in the data as well, is the role that renewable energy can play, especially distributed generation, in helping their adaptation efforts, in their efforts to adapt to changing temperatures and less reliable electricity. So I'd be curious for your thoughts on kind of renewable energy as a player and as a catalyst for encouraging resiliency. In cities.
You know, I think it's terribly important. The combination of renewables, and I'm throwing geothermal into the renewable category here, provides the opportunity, new opportunities often, to generate energy here, wherever here is, and to use it here. One thing we see in the military is that the transmission lines or piping or any of that kind of thing is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to natural and man-made mischief. And so the notion that you can create energy locally that is used locally and then mix it with things off the grid, with energy provided from the grid, is very powerful. Military bases are doing that increasingly. The objective is not to get bases away from their civilian communities, but rather to perform support of each other in a new and different way. We have several military bases in the United States that are intending to get off the grid effectively, but not off the grid actually, because it's every bit as important for the base to support its surrounding community if there are disasters that occur in the region, as it is for the base to assure its own continued operation. And continuity of operations is a huge thing for the military. But so not only are renewables part of the long-term solution to the carbon emission problem, but they also provide security in a variety of other ways as well.
So there's a few investors in the audience, and I couldn't help but ask you, you know, given what you see about the changes that climate is bringing, the changes that climate change is bringing around the world, if you were an investor, you know, what industries or geographic regions would you avoid? Which are the ones to seek out? You know, what's your sense on kind of where the opportunities are for investors around the world?
Yeah, Connor told me that this question was coming. Until recently, I've had great faith in the investment advice that came out of Wall Street. We're pretty close to Wall Street, and if you brought in a sailor with all those years at sea to give you solid investment advice on the future, I'm beginning to doubt my sources here on Wall Street. But let me make a couple of general comments. Stepping back and viewing investments from a different perspective, perhaps. It depends, it seems to me, on what the investor wants to accomplish, whether his or her horizons are long or short. Is this for near-term gain only, or is this for long-term investment in things that over years, perhaps decades, will pay off? And they'll pay off not only in terms of the sustainment of the business and the value of the investment, but also the social contribution and the value in approaching some of the really different problems we face. So the planning horizon, both for the investor and for the company, it seems to me, are important. Alignment of corporate incentives and outcomes that you desire is important as well. It doesn't make sense to invest in an outfit that claims to want to do a certain set of things, but then incents its leadership to do things differently. And I've seen examples of that as well. So I guess it all boils down to making investment decisions, understanding whether you're in for the long haul or just along for the ride.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. Thank you very much for your comments, Vice Admiral, and for your wisdom. I'd now like to invite Claire Bonham-Carter up to the panel. We're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So Claire, and if you can join us, and also Larissa Bulla, who runs the Cities program at CDP and is one of the authors of the report. Who wants to get us kicked off? I see a hand there in the back on the left.
I'm Pete Granis. I work for the State Controller in New York. I have actually a very glib question for Claire about whether you did any correlation with your city engagement with the cities that get Fox News. But that's, you don't need to answer the question. But for the Vice Admiral, and congratulations, sir, and I appreciate your service to our country. But I do have a question on the preparedness and the reaction of the military, of the naval bases around the globe, with the exception of Great Lakes, where my family's from. What is being done to prepare our naval bases for climate change and sea level rise, number one? And two, why haven't I heard anything mentioned at all in the national discussion about the commitment to make sure our naval bases are going to be prepared for a rising sea?
Well, thanks very much for the question. Actually, that's it's a prominent topic in the leadership of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations have both spoken in front of Congress on this issue. The Secretary of the Navy has kind of gotten out in front and has been severely criticized for such things as making modest purchases biofuels and qualifying all kinds of Navy Marine aircraft and ships to run on biofuels. And the modest investment that has been made to allow that to happen has been a subject of criticism on Capitol Hill. Recently, our international audience will be surprised and aghast, perhaps, to learn that the House of Representatives of the United States recently attached an amendment to the defense authorization, which prohibited the services from spending any of the congressionally authorized money in preparation for climate change. Prohibited. Now that hopefully will not stand. The Senate won't take that. The President won't sign it. But it illustrates the kind of short-range thinking that we're up against. The leadership of the Navy and the Marine Corps are working really hard to get the word out, and they're not alone. The leadership of the other services are doing the same thing, and bases are, it's again an example of local initiative. Bases are taking the action within their own authority to reduce their footprint, to increase their cooperation with communities around them and the mutual support they give each other.
Great. Yes, sir, right here in the front. Thank you. No, you're good. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Well, I guess I'll start with Claire. Quick question on the report: what total population is represented by the cities that are in that responded to the survey?
I don't know that number off by heart, but does it say on this? Yes, it does. 394,360,000.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, and it's that represents 28%. Well, the cities represent 28% of the world's GDP, so it's not insignificant.
And if I could hog for one more, for Vice Admiral Gunn, I think it's interesting that the former CEO of ACOR, Vice Admiral McGinnis, as what was recently appointed to deal with some of these issues for the Navy. And I gather that's not the only branch of the service that is. And is some of the experience that they're gaining, whether it's setting up remote facilities for renewables in the field, or for converting bases or making bases more efficient, is there going to be some facility for sharing the knowledge they've gained and the innovation that they develop with the non-military sectors who are trying to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. And innovation in the services is taking place at all sorts of levels. As a matter of fact, the folks who were in the rear were kind of shamed by the Marine First Lieutenant and his platoon in Afghanistan that were calling back to the United States and asking their parents to send them roll-out solar panels so they could charge the batteries on their communications gear. But the answer is there's a memorandum of understanding between the Defense Department and the Department of Energy. And the two secretaries, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Energy, are mobilizing a whole of government effort in this regard, which will include information. I say whole of government. What that means really is whole of administration in our country. Hopefully, eventually, it means the real whole of government. But yeah, there's an awful lot taking place, and a lot of it is taking place in front of Congress at the moment.
Hi, this is Joyce with the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, and this is a question for either Claire or Larissa. Claire alluded to the competitive advantage that certain cities are trying to gain by being more resilient and therefore more protective of businesses in their environments. I wonder, number one, whether you can share any specific indicator based upon your comparison between your CDP cities and your CDP corporations to the indicator that mattered most, or the set of indicators that seem to be mattering most to corporations as it related to resiliency. And then second, to turn that on its head a little bit, to ask, were there any data that came out of the various surveys that showed a corporate opportunity? So in other words, cities and their risks could be in fact opportunities for corporations. And I wondered if that were clear in the data that you saw.
So I think actually it was last year's report, 2013, that shows that a little bit more clearly when we were looking specifically at the economic opportunities that cities saw from climate change, rather than this year when we were specifically looking at the risks that cities and businesses are seeing. And I think it's in the future that we'll be trying to draw out those type of performance indicators that you are alluding to. And now I've forgotten what the second part of your question was.
Just if there were a specific indicator that suggested corporations would see a competitive advantage for one city over another based on its resiliency.
I'm going to give Larissa an opportunity to talk, to answer that.
Thanks. No, well, we didn't look at those indicators specifically, but anecdotally, quite a number of cities did tell us that by improving the resilience within their city, that they were more economically competitive. The city of Oslo was quite confident in the fact that it was one of the more resilient cities in its region, and therefore more economically competitive. What we found was that a lot of the actions that cities were taking weren't specifically targeted necessarily at improving resiliency for businesses. In some cases, yes. But it was really a co-benefit for making a more stable economy and a more stable place to do business and indeed to live.
I might just add to that, Joyce. I think that, if you, to your question about opportunity, if you want to start a business that takes advantage of the fact that the climate is changing and businesses are going to have to adapt, the best thing to do that I would recommend is literally to just go through the CDP data, because there is all sorts of amazing information in there that shows the problems that cities are facing, and if you want to start a $1 billion business, you got to find a $1 billion problem, and there are many mentioned in the city's data and also in the corporate data. It's really incredible. So I'll leave you with that task. The one other thing I would add around economic competitiveness too is the fantastic example of Goldman Sachs building during Sandy here in New York, with the work that the city of New York did to make sure that the Battery Park City, where the Goldman worldwide headquarters is located, was raised up and set back so that when the storm surge happened, it wasn't going to inundate those buildings and those folks that live there. So Goldman, I know, looked at multiple different sites before they decided to choose Battery Park City. They looked at New Jersey. They looked at some stuff on the other side of the city. But I think that's a great example to see that that companies are taking into account these sorts of things when they figure out, hey, this is our worldwide headquarters. We need to make sure that we can ensure that business continuity for the long term. And New York's been doing some great work to do that, and many other cities in our sample are also taking steps to make sure that that happens. Yes, actually in the back, just behind you. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm Darcy Emmerman from AECOM. Under the Energy Independence and Security Act, federal facilities need to generate 30% of their energy from renewable sources. To go to your point, Admiral, the Navy has upped that level to 50%, and they really have decided under the Secretary that they have enough critical mass to move the bar, which we applaud. I think the challenge has become that when you get to the Office of Management and Budget or Congress, they have not figured out a way to value energy security per kilowatt hour. And there doesn't seem to be the political will to understand that we as ratepayers need to start to look at security as part of the cost of our electricity. Can you talk a little bit about where your organization is on how we begin that dialogue, the relationship between security and renewable energy?
That's a great question, and it's one that I don't really have a good answer for. There are many externalities right now that are not considered, certainly on the fossil fuel side of the equation. And it is dreadfully difficult in the United States, and I'd venture to say elsewhere as well, to get factored into the cost of the things that we use and the things that we buy, the actual costs of production, not to this generation, but to future generations. So it's probably the most difficult problem we face other than climate change itself. And the solution to that, or at least chipping away at it in a meaningful way, has got to be part of the challenge we give ourselves to persuade people that they have to participate. And so I think perhaps I'll take this idea back to the Military Advisory Board. Perhaps there's a report 6 that says, hey guys and gals, we need to pay attention to externalities in the entire range of things that we are considering doing and problems we're experiencing with regard to climate change and emissions.
Adam.
Hi, Adam Freed with the Nature Conservancy. I was struck by the fact that only 46% of cities were saying risk of drought, yet you're facing a fact where water is really dependent for food and energy for cities. There was a National Security Council report that suggested there will be more conflicts fought over water in the future than oil. Is this a sign of a lack of awareness, a lack of risk, or a lack of preparedness around water stress in cities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Claire, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that, and then Vice Admiral, I think you might have some thoughts on water.
It is a good question, Adam, and I think it's something that we were surprised about when we saw the data. I think the other thing is that a lot of cities are looking at water as an issue already. So therefore, have some adaptive capacity in place, have some programs in place, so therefore perhaps are not reporting it as such a risk because of that. And that's my optimistic hope, rather than that they're turning a blind eye to it and ignoring the fact that it is a risk they should be facing.
It's possible that Paul Faith here, who is one of my colleagues from CNA, is wondering if I'm going to lateral this to him, but I'm not.
As soon as I heard my name, I better wake up.
Yeah, Paul, thanks a lot, Paul. The fact is that one of the things that are, one of the many things not being considered in this conversation is the nexus between water and energy, and withdrawals and depletion of aquifers and the like. And another is the sharing of water resources, which is an international as well as an intercity problem. Our company is presently running on behalf of the Skoll Global Threats Foundation a game in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, on the sharing of water among India, China, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And we ran it twice. We ran it in Washington to make sure the game worked, and we ran it with people who were expert in the region. And then we went to Kuala Lumpur, and we ran it last week in Kuala Lumpur using farmers, people who had served important posts in the matter of making choices about how water resources get shared among countries that are growing dramatically in population. So, yeah, this is an important set of things to consider. And Paul and Delilah Barton, my other colleague here from CNA who's involved in the emergency preparedness work, are very, very much interested in pursuing that kind of issue.
I might also add, Adam, that one of the challenges of adaptation reporting that we see is the cities differentiating between risks that are very similar. So, for instance, you may, as a city, decide to choose temperature increase and heat waves as a drought. As a risk, and as opposed to drought, even though drought is an obvious consequence of temperature increase and heat waves, and this is certainly one of the things that we run into, and we see in the data, cities reporting sort of multiple risks that are very similar to one another, because climate change has so many varied effects, and it will impact us in so many different ways that that kind of drawing it out and turning it into data is always not necessarily a precise science. So anyway, but we hope to work on that down the road, and I think the qualitative element of our data can help to draw that out a little bit more as cities explain what the risk is as temperature increase, heat waves, et cetera. What are the impacts going to be? Then you start to get into cities talking about drought and water scarcity and other issues like that. So that's great. Sir in the back.
Hi, I look forward to reading your report. Nicholas Oversack from the City Controller's Office. I'm wondering if any of your data, either that cities have gathered on their own corporate climate, business climate, or the corporation data speaks to business preference for mitigation practices, investments in city resiliency efforts, versus those that stem carbon on a wider scale, a dedicated carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme. And if you can speak to whether or not businesses have expressed a certain level of support or direct their energies to one of those two categories in particular. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Do you want to take that, Larissa? Okay. So, well, why don't I take that one? Our data does, I don't know if it would necessarily express a preference. Individual companies report various things that they're interested in. But one of the things that we did recently was release a report on the number of companies in the U.S. that are using a shadow price of carbon in their own internal estimates. And I think, this report made the front page of the New York Times for a reason, and that is that in the national debate around whether we should have a carbon tax or a price on carbon, or however we do it, the fact is that a lot of these companies are already building that into their own internal calculations, and they're using that to help them make predictions in the future about how their business is going to be affected when there is a price on carbon. So the data from that the companies report to CDP is incredibly useful at pointing the direction that a lot of companies are taking. Now, of course, not every company is using a shadow price on carbon, but a lot of the big guys are, and you see a wide variety of different approaches to dealing with this issue in the CDP data. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah. Good. Anybody else? I think we've got time for just maybe two more. Go ahead. Yeah. Right here.
Quick question. So I think you said there's 207 cities that you're reporting on here. So I don't know the number of cities in the world, but I imagine it's tens of thousands. If you were magically able to access their data, do you think you'd see like a huge drop-off in terms of what they're thinking about in terms of climate action and what they're actually doing about it? Or would you see more of a kind of gradual slope in terms of action to inaction?
Sure.
No, I think it's a good question. I would love for those cities to report so that we could find out. I don't think so. I mean, what we're seeing is that cities literally can't afford not to act, and whether they are, the different ways that they are justifying it, there's a really big range. But I don't think that anywhere in the world cities are able to not act. So I would hope that if all of those cities were to be reporting to CDP, that we would see a consistency. And of course, we do see some cities that are really big players in this. We're here in New York City, who is, maybe as a result of Hurricane Sandy, but also just having a very proactive government, is taking really leading steps. But yeah, I think it's fair to say, I don't know what you would say, Claire, I think it's fair to say that globally cities are definitely stepping up.
I just want to, I think what you're saying is that we have a self-selecting bunch of cities, right, who are reporting, so it's going to be higher performance. I want to point out that we have some tiny villages reporting. So we have one Turkish village that has 215 people that reports to CDP. And I think you'll find that there are a number of other little villages around the world where people are doing things. And also take other parts of the world. I work with a lot of different size cities, some that are much smaller. They're doing climate action planning, but they don't have the budget or the resources to spend the time filling in CDP's questionnaire. So there's another issue there about resources. So I also think that, yes, it's a self-reporting bunch of cities, but yes, there are a lot of other cities globally that are doing a lot of things. It's not going to be perfect, but be good.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We're out of time, and so I want to end the event. Please join me in thanking our illustrious panel. So this is the end of the event, but it's not the end of the story on climate risk in cities. Many of you in the room are going to be taking this work forward in your various organizations, and CDP is going to continue to publish research on this topic. For the cities in the audience, we will be providing the climate risk and adaptation data that we've used here from companies directly to you in your benchmarking report, so you can have access to the data about the companies in your city and make it a little bit more relevant for you. And that'll be part of your benchmark report, which is going to be released later this year. In addition, everybody in the audience, you can review all of the data that CDP has on our website at cdp.net. You can look at the individual city responses, you can look at the individual company responses, and there's some fascinating stuff as we were discussing, Joyce. And I want to just say a very quick thank you to the entire CDP Cities team for hard work in pulling together this event. So thank you very much, guys. Larissa Bulla, Pauline Martin, Andrea Bond, Sarah Telehoon, and Katie Walsh, and Kira Appleby. In particular, Larissa authored the report, and Katie organized this event. So thank you guys very much. Congratulations. And thank you, all of you, for coming to our event. We very much appreciate it. There's some drinks outside, and please join us in the pub later on. Thank you.